Hey guys, it's Sandro here, and today's video is a review and a head-to-head challenge comparing 4 high-end premium waxes in the form of P21S 100% Canuba, Pinnacle Sovereign, Scholl Concepts Premium Vintage, and Swissvax Shield. I'll add a little info here about each wax as far as local prices and quantities go, but the core of this review will be assessing and comparing these waxes in many areas, such as their user experience, gloss and saturation levels, the feel and slickness of them, their hydrophobic behavior and potential durability. I'll then sum up this video with my personal conclusions and thoughts on these waxes, which are not only going to be based on the footage in this video, but also on my past experience and prior testing with these waxes. A lot of you guys have asked about my thoughts on premium waxes, so this is a video I've been wanting to make for a while, and I'll actually try and do a few more of these wax comparison reviews, and maybe down the track take all of the ones that perform the best and do a comparison video of my favorites. So you can comment below on what you'd like to see reviewed, and if it's available here locally, reasonably affordable and popular in the comments, I'll add it to the list. Now, both the test panels you'll see in this video were washed, decontaminated, corrected, and given an IPA wipe prior to applying the waxes. However, on the next black panel you'll see in a bit, as per usual, I left some compounding haze in the finish, so you guys can see the results for yourselves better on camera. But I'm going to start this review here by discussing and evaluating the user experience of these waxes as far as application goes, but focusing more on the pleasure or pain of their application rather than the technical steps, which quite honestly is like most waxes out there, in that you want to apply them very sparingly, nice and evenly, give them time to slightly haze over but not entirely dry up, and then buff them with a microfiber cloth, all of which is going to vary slightly depending on your environment. So starting with P21S 100% Canuba, I don't think it's an overstatement in saying that it's just a pure joy to work with. In fact, I'd even go as far as to say that compared to the brand's own Concourse Looks wax, which has a lower Canuba content, this wax is surprisingly even easier and nicer to work with. It spreads into the panel with extreme ease, and I would have to say that in that area it is the nicest wax here to lay down with the least amount of friction, as your applicator just glides beautifully over the paint and almost entices you to keep on working it in. When it comes to the wipe off, it's yet again quite a nice and easy experience, with just minimal friction at first as you gather the majority of the excess wax, but that quickly turns into a no-fuss, streak-free and beautiful clear finish. There is perhaps one other wax here that did have a slightly nicer wipe-off experience, but all in all, it would be a stretch to say anything other than that P21S 100% Canuba has a fantastically easy and rewarding user experience. Next up was Pinnacle Sovereign Wax. In slight contrast to P21S, this wax does have a bit more grip as you lay it down, but this is just a direct comparison as it's definitely not what I consider to be overly grippy or resistant. Just an observation when doing side-by-side tests. Sovereign wax also tends to lay down a little thicker and more opaque than most of these other waxes, even when you do apply similar amounts, which is again just an observation. You'll also find that unlike the other 3 waxes here, it really doesn't tend to haze over as much or takes much longer to do so, though you definitely don't want to allow it to sit too long. So it's actually the fastest wax to work with, as you can lay it down and depending on your environment, rather quickly wipe it down, whereas the other waxes here do require a little more haze and bonding time by comparison. Now, directly comparing it to the other 3 waxes here, it does have a slightly grippier and more time-consuming wipe-off, though there is perhaps another wax here in this review that is a touch more difficult to level or wipe down. But in saying that, it's still rather easy and a pleasant wax to work with, compared to the many waxes I've used over the last 25 years. Next up was Scholl Concepts Premium Vintage Wax. I'll start by saying that out of all the waxes here, Premium Vintage does perhaps have just a touch more grip or friction than the rest as you lay it down. But again guys, this is just more of an observation rather than a flaw, as it's still relatively nice and easy to lay down without too much fuss. Just like Pinnacle Sovereign Wax, it also tends to lay down rather thick, or at least thicker than the other two waxes when similar amounts are applied, which is just something to note and to adjust your technique accordingly. I would also say that as far as flash or haze times go, it also seems to be the one that took the longest to get there, so it's perhaps not the quickest to work with if you're working a section at a time. But in saying all of that, the wipe off itself is just pure joy and a pleasure, and it would have to take first place here in being the nicest wax to level down with such a rewarding wipe down experience with your cloth that's really addictive and just makes you want to keep on wiping it well beyond what's needed because of its great feel and feedback. Last but not least was Swissvax Shield. Now the first thing you notice with Shield is that it has quite an uncommon tropical fruity smell, which I actually quite like and does add to the user experience. Scholl Wax actually has a chocolate smell, and I love chocolate, but I'd still say that Swissvax smells better. Whereas both the P21S and Pinnacle waxes have more standard and solventy wax smells that's pretty common. Now as far as the application of Shield goes, I'd say it's about middle of the pack here, being not quite as nice as P21S, but also with a little less friction than both Pinnacle and Scholl. But overall, yet again, quite pleasant to lay down with your applicator with no real fuss. I'd also say that it sits in the middle here as far as flash or bonding time goes, not being as super quick as Pinnacle, but not taking as long as Scholl vintage wax. However, when it comes to the wipe off, I would have to say that compared to the other three waxes here, it is the one that felt a little more grippy, similar to Pinnacle Sovereign, but perhaps with slightly more friction, and it also seemed to be the one that took a few extra passes with a cloth to get it perfectly streak free. Now again, this was just compared to the other waxes in this review, as I don't feel that Shield is an overly difficult wax to work with unless you do leave it too long and allow it to fully dry, which is an entirely different story and just something to note here. I'll also mention here that as a past mobile detailer, I did personally find that Pinnacle Sovereign Wax was the most sun-friendly wax to apply out of the bunch, causing fewer issues than the rest in that outdoor and open environment. But overall, I think if I was being as objective as possible, I would say that P21S does have the easiest no-fuss application. While if I was being a little more subjective, I'd say I personally enjoyed working with Scholl Vintage Wax a little more, while Pinnacle Sovereign came in third and Swissvax Shield fourth. After allowing the panels to fully cure indoors over the weekend, the next test was evaluating the ability of these waxes to improve the look of automotive paint. There's a few things or characteristics of a wax that affect how well they look on car paint, which in no particular order are firstly the amounts of gloss or the reflective quality that can impose on the paint. Secondly is the saturation or richness and vibrancy that can leave behind in the finish. And thirdly is the defect masking ability in how well they can reduce or hide paint imperfections such as haze, oxidation, or minor swirls. But ultimately, all these aesthetic abilities of a wax add up to one important thing, which quite simply is how much better can they make the paint look. Now, although I'm going to discuss my findings and observations, I'd also like you guys to largely judge these results for yourselves and draw your own conclusions, because I really work hard to capture footage that allows you to see the results clearly on camera. Now, primarily focusing on the black test panel, as it's just harder to see the difference on the red panel, there was really 3 waxes here that actually all did quite well in improving the reflective gloss, adding saturation and masking a few minor defects. But there was 1 wax here that just immediately drew my attention with fantastic reflectiveness, a dark rich finish, and an amazing ability to mask so much of the haze and dullness in the paint, which was Scholl Concepts Premium Vintage Wax. Honestly guys, it's not that often I'll make that judgment or draw my conclusions so swiftly, but there's no other way of putting it other than this wax just looks unbelievably good. And after doing a whole bunch of test panels in the lead up to this video, Scholl's vintage wax just looked so much better every time. In my eyes, there wasn't that much separating the other 3 waxes, but if I had to rate them as far as looks go, I'd personally say that P21S came in 2nd place, Pinnacle in 3rd, and Swissvax in 4th place as far as looks go. But again, I'd like you guys to also judge the look of these waxes for yourselves. Now just to add a little more info as far as at least gloss levels go, I did take a few readings with my RoPoint IQ meter, in which you guys can pause the video if you want to analyze all the data. But what I'll put up on screen here is the average readings of both the 20 and 60 degree reflection gloss angles combined for firstly the unwaxed paint and then the wax paint for each of the individual 4 waxes. Now overall, you will hopefully see in the average readings that all the waxes were able to quite significantly improve the gloss levels compared to the unwaxed paint. But what you'll also see is that there really wasn't all that much in it from one wax to another. In fact, both 21S and Scholl had identical gloss average readings of 84 units apiece, while Pinnacle was slightly behind with 80 units, and Swissvax in 3rd place had an almost identical 79 units of gloss average. I think any additional data we can collect is always useful and worth exploring, but I'd be lying if I said all these readings were in line with how well these waxes looked on the paint. But I still wanted to provide this additional information and allow you guys to draw your own conclusions. Next up was evaluating the slickness or lack of friction that each of these waxes creates on automotive paint. Increased slickness of car paint has many benefits, one of which that shouldn't be disregarded is the pure joy of wiping the paint down with such a beautifully silky feel that's just enticing and so rewarding to your senses. But perhaps more importantly, that reduced friction on the paint will also help reduce wash-induced swells, as it allows your wash mitt to glide over the paint with far less resistance. And thirdly, that increased slickness can also help prevent contamination, such as fallout, tar, and even bird poo, from bonding to the paint as strongly and being rinsed or washed off much more easily. So I just wanted to explain that reduced friction on the paint can in fact provide many benefits in my personal experience. Now, I'll start off by saying that all the waxes here do a fairly good job at leaving quite a nice slick feel on the paint, so I don't believe that any were overly bad in that way. But this is a head-to-head direct challenge, and some waxes definitely did better than others in this area. In first place, there was just no question that Scholl Vintage Wax was without a doubt the slickest wax here, as my old coating bottle just flew down its section with almost no friction at all. In second place, it was also quite obvious that Pinnacle Sovereign Wax was the next slickest wax in this comparison. Third and fourth place was a little closer, as both P21S and Swissvax had similar amounts of reduced friction in their finish, but Swissvax Shield just seemed to have a touch more slickness, taking third place. So on to the water behaviour testing to evaluate the hydrophobic performance of these 4 waxes. Now, in my experience, traditional waxes really aren't highly hydrophobic forms of paint protection if you compare them to more recent paint sealants and coatings. So I wouldn't expect anything too crazy here as far as water sheeting or beading goes. But in saying that, a good wax should still be able to sheet the water in a relatively quick fashion and display at least some improved water bead contact angles that will help making washing and drying your vehicle much quicker and easier, as well as prevent water pooling on certain horizontal car panels that can lead to large water mineral etchings. Now, as with all the tests here, I also want you guys to judge the results for yourselves and draw your own conclusions, but I'll also be giving you mine. So as you continue to watch the footage, you'll hopefully see that one wax here does struggle a little to sheet the water as quick as the others, and also does display flatter water contact angles and more irregular water bead droplets, which is Pinnacle Sovereign Wax. I just think that compared to the other 3 waxes here, it does fall a little short in its hydrophobic performance, and it seems that the more water it comes in contact with, the more it continues to struggle. So for me, it quite clearly came in 4th place in this test. I think 2nd and 3rd place as far as water behaviour goes was the closest here, with both P21S and Swissvax having relatively similar hydrophobic qualities. But I also think P21S was a little better in this area overall, which I also based on my prior tests before making this video. Scholl Concepts Premium Vintage Wax was just unquestionably the most hydrophobic wax in this direct comparison. But I'll also go out on a limb and say that as far as a traditional wax goes, it's probably got to be one of the more hydrophobic ones out there. It did consistently sheet the water faster than the rest. Its water bead contact angles, although not amazing, were fairly decent, and again the best here, and for those reasons it had to take first place in this test. The final test was a chemical resistance test to try and estimate the environmental resistance and potential durability of these waxes compared to one another. So in other words, how much can these waxes take before they start to deteriorate? For this I used CarPro Multi-X at a 1:5 dilution ratio, firstly applying it more mildly and then getting more physical and aggressive with each additional application. No test is perfect, guys, and one person applying the same wax in Australia versus someone applying it in Germany versus someone applying it in Alaska, all on different vehicles with different mileage and different maintenance routines, are all going to have different outcomes of durability. But one thing I can say is that generally the products that can take more abuse in these tests also tend to last longer in the real world based on my own experience. Now, as the footage continues to roll, what you will see by the end of this chemical testing is that firstly, Pinnacle Sovereign Wax was a little disappointing here, and even before we get to the end of this test, it really started to lose all its performance rather quickly after just a couple of light chemical hits. In slight contrast, P21S did much better here initially, but ultimately after a few more hits, it too started to diminish a little quicker than what I would have liked to have seen. Swissvax Shield, on the other hand, performed much better here, and I'd actually say that this last chemical test was where it shined the most, and also proved that it can take a bit of punishment and hang in there almost as good as any traditional wax, if not better. But ultimately, it was once again Scholl Vintage Wax that took first place here, just being able to resist the chemical a touch better than Swissvax Shield, and hold on that what I thought was quite impressive for a natural and traditional wax based on my past testing. I wanted to share something I observed while testing all these waxes side by side on various test panels. What you'll hopefully see on this second red panel is a fairly similar result to the first black panel, but maybe with some slight variations. The black panel has a softer, low solid clear coat, while the red panel has a harder, high solid clear coat. I have many variations of paints on my test panels, as it's important for me to test a wide variety of products on different paints. But what I actually observed throughout my testing was that Swissvax, and to a lesser degree also Pinnacle, seem to always perform a little better when applied to the harder clear coats compared to the softer ones. While I didn't see much of a difference either way with Scholl Vintage Wax, and if anything, P21S almost seemed to work a little better on the softer clear coats. I won't say that this is conclusive evidence, but it was fairly consistent and just another piece of information I thought I'd add here. Most detailers who apply ceramic coatings for a living will tell you that they're generally more difficult to apply on softer paint and also don't tend to last or perform quite as well on those paint types in the long run. But I found it interesting to also see some of these variations in performance depending on the paint type that these waxes were applied to. So, onto my conclusions. I'll start by saying that there's a reason I chose these 4 particular premium waxes for this review, which is firstly because I already had them and didn't have almost $1,000 to drop on top shelf waxes for this review. But secondly, I have them for a reason, which is that in my opinion, these are 4 of some of the greatest car waxes ever made. But in saying that, it's been many years since I've used most of them. And the way I used to judge and test products in the past is very different to how I test them now. So I was also really interested to revisit them and see how they would perform in a more modern day test and evaluation. Out of all the waxes here, Pinnacle Sovereign Wax is the one I've used the most. As a past mobile detailer, I found it to be the one that was most forgiving to work with outdoors and was also the fastest wax to work with in that environment. And for a premium wax, it was still quite affordable, looked great, did the job rather well, and my clients were almost always happy with it. So for all those reasons, it was my first choice as a premium wax based on my needs back then. But I should also mention that I almost always applied it over a sealant such as Wolfgang Deep Gloss, and maybe it was that combination that really worked well rather than the wax as a standalone application. I really wanted this wax to do better than it did in this video review, but I'd be lying if I said that it did all that well compared to its competition here. I still think it's a great wax, and depending on your needs, it may even be the best wax here, but I also think that based on my more recent testing, it really wouldn't be the one I'd choose over any of the other 3. There's no other brand here that screams premium wax more than Swissvax. It's really a highly praised car wax maker with a great history in this space. I also want to be clear that Swissvax and all the other brands in this review make other waxes too. So this isn't one brand versus another. It's about one specific wax against another, and Shield is one of their more affordable to mid-range waxes, so it's not necessarily a reflection of their best. But I was never able to afford their best, so Shield was the one I thought would be the best compromise for my needs. But in saying that, Shield is presented as just about their most durable wax, and I tend to agree that for a natural wax, it is rather durable, and if you're a person that's only ever going to use a premium wax on your car and want it to last a while, this could still be the go. However, there are a few other waxes that will last just as long, if not longer. You'll also find truckloads of paint sealants that should easily outlast it. I'm sure that other waxes from the brand will look and maybe even feel better and also be nicer to apply, but in all those areas, Shield just wasn't the winner here in this review by comparison, and I'd be lying if I said otherwise. However, leaving objectivity at the door, there's just something about certain brands like Swissvax and even Polish Angel, which I've talked about in the past, that have a certain appeal that just makes them feel special and just makes using their products a special occasion, which is such a hard thing to put a price on. A couple of decades ago, Shield might have very well been a form of paint protection at the top of its game, and you could objectively justify its price and use. But with all that has happened, as far as paint protection goes in recent years, it's going to take a very subjective approach to justify it these days, and that's okay in my opinion as long as you're honest about it. P21S 100% Canuba is just a beautiful wax in so many ways. It may have not been the outright winner in many of the tests, but it generally did well as a whole, being a solid all-round performer. It's also the cheapest or most affordable wax here, and whether or not you care about using a wax with a high and quality Canuba content, you just have to accept that it's expensive to source and refine quality Canuba, and it's rare to find a wax containing both at this price point. It's also rare to find a high Canuba content wax with such a great and easy user experience. Not to mention that it is one of the better looking waxes here, with some fairly decent water behaviour. We all have different wants and needs when it comes to a natural wax, and for me personally, the user experience is at the top of my list. To put it simply, if I don't enjoy using a traditional wax, I won't use it these days, because I don't tend to use waxes if my ultimate goals are durability or hydrophobic performance, as in those cases I'll exclusively use a sealant or coating. However, I still would have liked to have seen this wax do a little better during my chemical testing, and I also would have liked it to feel a little slicker, which probably would have put it higher on the list here. Last but certainly not least is Scholl Concepts Premium Vintage Wax. There's a reason I love revisiting and retesting older waxes and sealants, because sometimes you get to rediscover something great that you never even realized you had or ever appreciated it as much as you should have. I've always liked this wax, but to be honest, I never realized just how good it was. I almost feel guilty knowing that this jar of wax goodness was just sitting on my shelf and collecting dust for a couple of years when I could have been putting it to good use. There's no other wax here that I enjoyed applying more, and even though P21S may be a little easier to use, it's just a super slick feel you get from vintage wax and its wipe off, which is just so beautiful and addictive. I also don't think it was even close when comparing the look of these waxes. Vintage was just a clear winner to my eyes, and I'm really interested now to place it up against some of my favourite sealants and coatings to see how it compares. The slickness of this wax is just so uncommonly slick for a wax. It's more like a super slick sealant, and both the water behaviour and chemical resistance was about as good as any traditional wax I've ever tried. I was genuinely surprised at every turn at just how well this wax performed, and I can tell you right now that as soon as I get a free day, it's definitely going on one of my cars, and I'm looking forward to it. It's really not like me to be so single-minded and swift in making up my mind in these reviews, but this wax was an outright clear winner in just about every area, which is again not so common in these comparisons and reviews. And if anyone out there has a jar of vintage wax around, please give it another go and let me know what you think. I know you guys usually see me reviewing and using coatings or spray coatings and hybrid waxes in my videos because as a professional detailer, these products make the most sense to provide my clients with the most advanced paint protection around today. But on a more personal note, I still love traditional waxes and use them to this very day on my own vehicles for the pure joy and personal connection they provide me with, and I don't think that will ever change. So are premium waxes really worth the money? Probably not. But if we made every decision in life based on level-headed judgments, we'd all be driving base model Accords and Camrys, which is probably the best general choice. But sometimes when we can, we want to splurge on a TRD or Type R instead, just because of the way it makes you feel. And I think that's also just fine if it puts a smile on your face. If you enjoyed this video and would like to say thanks and support future content, please consider buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/ccad, which I'll have a link to in the description box. And thank you everyone for the support so far, it's hugely appreciated. As always, I really hope you guys enjoyed and found this video useful. Please share this video, like, comment, and subscribe to this channel to show your support for this content, and I'll see you guys soon.